Since the dawn of human civilization, a single, compelling question has lingered in the minds of warriors, philosophers, and common people alike. It is a question born of our most primal survival instincts, whispered in the training halls of ancient empires and debated in the schoolyards of the modern world. If two unarmed human beings are locked in a room and there are absolutely no rules, no weapons, and no escape, who walks out alive? Which style of combat is actually the truth, and which is merely an illusion? For centuries, this question was impossible to answer definitively. Martial arts developed in geographical isolation. A master of kung fu in the mountains of China would never cross paths with a French savate kickboxer. A Senegalese wrestler would never grip the canvas jacket of a Japanese judoka because they could not test their arts against one another. Martial arts became shrouded in mysticism, theory, and untested dogma. But the desire to find the ultimate, unified truth of human combat is not a modern phenomenon. To find the earliest attempt to answer this question, we must travel back over 2.5 millennia to the sun-baked soil of ancient Greece. In the year 708 BCE, the ancient Greeks introduced a new event to the 33rd Olympic Games. They had already established boxing, which relied entirely on striking with the fists, and wrestling, which relied entirely on grappling and throwing. But the Greeks, obsessed with the absolute limits of human capability, realized that neither sport represented the totality of a real fight. A real fight does not stop when two men clinch, nor does it stop when they hit the ground. To bridge this gap, they created a sport called pankration. The word is a combination of the Greek words pan, meaning all, and kratos, meaning power or strength. It translates roughly to all powers or all-encompassing combat. Pankration was the ancient world's first iteration of mixed martial arts. It was a terrifying, almost entirely unregulated spectacle of violence. There were only 2 rules in Olympic pankration: no biting and no gouging of the eyes or mouth. Everything else was completely legal. Fighters could punch, kick, elbow, and knee. They could throw their opponents to the hard sand, and unlike modern Olympic wrestling, the fight did not stop when they hit the ground. On the ground, they could apply bone-breaking joint locks, chokeholds, and devastating strikes to a downed opponent. The matches were held in the skama, a patch of loose sand. There were no rounds, no time limits, and no weight classes. A match continued relentlessly until one man either lost consciousness or signaled his submission by raising a single index finger. The Spartans, famous for their absolute dedication to warfare, actually refused to compete in Olympic pankration. It was not because they feared the violence, but because their military code forbade them from ever surrendering. To compete in a sport where raising a finger to admit defeat was the primary method of escape was deeply dishonorable to a Spartan hoplite. The brutality of pankration produced legends that echo through history. The most famous was a fighter named Aretion of Phigalia, who achieved a chilling immortality in the year 564 BCE. Aretion was fighting in the Olympic finals. His opponent managed to secure a devastating chokehold from behind, wrapping his legs around Aretion's waist and his arms tightly around his throat, cutting off the blood flow to the brain. Aretion was seconds away from losing consciousness. His trainer, standing on the edge of the sand, shouted, "What a noble epitaph! He was never defeated at Olympia." Spurred by this final call for glory, Aretion faked a movement to the left, then violently snapped his body to the right, grabbing his opponent's ankle and snapping the bone completely out of its socket. The excruciating pain caused the opponent to instantly raise his index finger in submission, but in the violent torsion of breaking the ankle, Aretion's own neck was fatally snapped by the chokehold. Aretion died in the sand, but because his opponent had submitted first, the Olympic judges posthumously awarded the championship to Aretion's corpse, crowning his lifeless head with the victor's olive wreath. This was the terrifying reality of pankration. It was a sport that demanded the absolute synthesis of striking and grappling, a grueling test of human endurance. But like boxing, as the Greek era faded into the Roman Empire, and as the Romans transitioned from the Republic to a Christianized empire, these brutal gladiatorial contests were banned. For nearly 1,500 years, the concept of a unified, anything-goes combat sport vanished from the earth. Martial arts retreated into isolation. Boxing developed in the West. Various forms of karate, kung fu, and jujitsu developed in the East. They evolved in vacuums, relying on compliance, tradition, and theory. It would take a global industrial revolution, transoceanic travel, and a uniquely eccentric family in South America to resurrect the spirit of Pankration and bring the ultimate question back to the forefront of human consciousness. To trace the direct lineage of modern mixed martial arts, we must leave antiquity and travel to Japan in the late 19th century. For hundreds of years, Japan had been a closed, feudal society ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate and enforced by the samurai class. The samurai practiced a devastating form of close-quarters combat known as jujutsu. Jujutsu translates to the gentle art, but the name is highly deceptive. It was designed for a battlefield scenario where a samurai had lost his sword and had to fight an armored opponent empty-handed, because punching a man wearing iron and lacquered leather will only break your own hand. Jujutsu focused heavily on throws, joint locks, and strangulations to disable or kill an armored enemy. But in 1868, the Meiji Restoration fundamentally altered the fabric of Japan. The emperor was restored to power, the borders were thrown open to Western technology, and the samurai class was officially abolished. The wearing of swords in public was outlawed. With the samurai disbanded, the brutal battlefield techniques of traditional jujutsu fell out of favor. It was viewed as an archaic, thuggish relic of a feudal past. Masterless samurai, known as ronin, often used their skills to act as enforcers or brawlers, further degrading the reputation of the art. It was during this cultural upheaval that a brilliant, slightly built Japanese educator named Jigoro Kano stepped forward to save the martial heritage of his nation. Kano was a frail youth who had taken up jujutsu to protect himself from bullies, studying under some of the last great masters of the old systems. But Kano was an intellectual. He realized that for jujutsu to survive the modern era, it had to be stripped of its lethal battlefield techniques and transformed into an educational system, a sport that could build character, physical fitness, and discipline without routinely crippling its students. In 1882, Jigoro Kano founded a new martial art. He removed the lethal eye gouges, the strikes to vital organs, and the small joint manipulations that caused permanent injury. He kept the throws, the pins, and the safe submission holds. He called his new system Judo, which translates to the gentle way. Kano's fundamental philosophy was Shiryoku Zenyo, meaning maximum efficiency, minimum effort. He taught that a smaller, weaker person could defeat a larger, stronger opponent, not by meeting force with force, but by using the opponent's own momentum against them. If a giant pushes you, you do not push back. You pull them forward, disrupting their balance, and throw them to the mat using leverage and technique. To prove the superiority of his new system, Kano's students engaged in a famous series of challenge matches in 1886 against the traditional, brutal jujutsu schools arranged by the Tokyo Police Department. Because Kano's judo allowed for intense, full resistance sparring, known as randori, without the constant fear of death or permanent injury, his students had far more practical, live combat experience than the traditionalists who could only practice their lethal moves in theory. The judokas dominated the tournament, and judo became the official martial art of the Japanese police and public school system. But Jigoro Kano was not just a martial artist, he was an ambassador. He wanted judo to become a global phenomenon. To achieve this, he selected his most formidable, battle-hardened students and sent them across the oceans to spread the art, take on all challengers, and prove the superiority of Japanese judo to the rest of the world. One of these emissaries was a man whose journey would inadvertently spark the creation of modern MMA. His name was Mitsuyo Maeda, but history remembers him by the theatrical stage name he adopted during his travels, Konde Koma, the Count of Combat. Mitsuyo Maeda was a physical anomaly. He stood only 5 feet, 5 inches tall, and weighed around 150 pounds. Yet, he possessed the explosive strength of a silverback gorilla and a mastery of balance that made him virtually impossible to knock off his feet. Leaving Japan in 1904, Maeda embarked on an astonishing global odyssey. He traveled to the United States, performing demonstrations for President Theodore Roosevelt at the White House. He traveled to Great Britain, Spain, Cuba, and Mexico, Maeda did not just teach judo, he fought. To fund his travels, he entered professional wrestling tournaments and issued open challenges in theaters and circus tents. He offered massive cash prizes to any local boxer, wrestler, or street brawler who could defeat him. Fighting across the globe against larger, heavier men who did not follow the polite rules of a Japanese dojo, Maeda was forced to adapt. He realized that the pure, upright throwing techniques of judo were sometimes dangerous against a skilled Western boxer who could knock him out before he secured a grip. Maeda began to heavily incorporate the ground fighting aspect of judo, known as newaza, into his real-world fights. He discovered a fundamental truth of combat. If you can take a powerful striker down to the ground, you completely neutralize their ability to generate kinetic energy. A boxer cannot throw a knockout punch when they are flat on their back. On the ground, the fight is dictated by leverage, weight distribution, and joint manipulation. On the ground, Maeda was a god, and the giant European wrestlers and American boxers were hopelessly out of their element. Historical records suggest Maeda fought in over 2,000 challenge matches during his global tour, and he rarely lost. He was the world's first true mixed martial artist, seamlessly blending the throwing mechanics of the East with the gritty, submission-heavy reality of unscripted combat. In 1914, Maeda's travels finally brought him to the sweltering, vibrant nation of Brazil. He decided to settle in the northern state of Pará, in the city of Belém. There, he was assisted in navigating local politics and establishing a Japanese immigration colony by a prominent, politically connected Brazilian businessman named Gaston Gracie. To repay Gaston for his invaluable help, Maeda offered to do something highly unusual. He offered to teach the closely guarded secrets of Japanese judo to Gaston's eldest son, a hyperactive, rebellious teenager named Carlos Gracie. Carlos was mesmerized by the diminutive Japanese master. He trained intensely with Maeda for several years, learning the mechanics of leverage, the physics of throws, and the brutal efficiency of chokes and joint locks. When Maeda eventually moved on, the Gracie family relocated to Rio de Janeiro. Carlos, now armed with the esoteric knowledge of the East, opened his own academy in 1925. He began teaching the art to his younger brothers, Oswaldo, Gaston Jr., George, and the youngest, a frail, sickly boy named Helio. It was Helio Gracie who would take the foundation laid by Jigoro Kano and Mitsuyo Maeda and completely reverse engineer it to create a martial art that would change the world. Helio Gracie was not a natural athlete. As a child, he suffered from chronic fainting spells and extreme physical frailty. When he watched his older brothers teaching the robust, explosive throws of Japanese judo, he realized his body was simply incapable of executing the techniques. He lacked the muscular strength to hoist a larger man over his hip, and he lacked the speed to execute a dynamic sweep. But Helio possessed an incredibly sharp, analytical mind. Because he could not rely on speed or strength, he was forced to rely entirely on mechanics, physics, and absolute perfect leverage. Helio began to adapt the Japanese techniques, heavily modifying them to suit his frail physique. He realized that attempting to fight a larger man while standing was a losing proposition. The bigger man would always hit harder and throw harder. Therefore, Helio's entire philosophy became about taking the fight to the ground as safely and quickly as possible. Once on the ground, gravity became the great equalizer. Helio perfected techniques that allowed a fighter fighting off of their back, a position known as the guard, to survive, control, and ultimately submit a much heavier opponent who was on top of them. He utilized the strongest muscles in the human body, the legs and the hips, to control the opponent's posture, wrap them in a web of limbs, and slowly isolate a single joint, an elbow, a shoulder, or a neck, applying overwhelming mechanical force until the bone snapped or the opponent surrendered. This hyper-specialized, ground-focused adaptation became known as Gracie Jiu-Jitsu or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, BJJ. But the Gracies were not content to simply practice their art in a closed academy. They were incredibly prideful, fiercely competitive, and they wanted to prove that their family's invention was the single most effective form of unarmed combat on Earth. To prove this, Carlos and Helio initiated the Gracie Challenge. They placed advertisements in all the major newspapers of Rio de Janeiro. The ad was a direct provocation. It read, "If you want a broken arm or rib, contact Carlos Gracie." They issued an open invitation to any martial artist of any size, from any discipline, boxers, capoeira fighters, wrestlers, karate masters, or street thugs to come to their academy and fight them. There were virtually no rules. There were no weight classes, no time limits, no points, and no gloves. You fought until someone tapped the mat in submission or someone was knocked unconscious. In Brazil, these brutal, unregulated fights became known as Vale Tudo, which translates directly from Portuguese to anything goes. The Gracie Challenge matches were initially held on the mats of their garage academy behind closed doors. Boxers would arrive expecting a quick knockout. The frail-looking Helio, or one of his brothers, would simply dive for their legs, drag them to the floor, and within minutes, the boxer would be tapping frantically as his arm was twisted to the breaking point by a Kimura lock. Word spread rapidly. The fights moved from the garage to massive soccer stadiums, drawing tens of thousands of rabid Brazilian fans. Helio Gracie, weighing barely 140 pounds, became a national hero, taking on giant wrestlers and knocking out heavyweight boxers using nothing but leverage and chokeholds. For decades, Vale Tudo existed almost exclusively as a Brazilian phenomenon. The Gracies knew the answer to the primordial question. They had empirical, blood-soaked proof that a pure striker with no knowledge of grappling was fundamentally helpless when dragged to the ground. But the rest of the world remained entirely ignorant. While the Gracies were breaking arms in the sweltering stadiums of Rio, the martial arts landscape in the United States and Europe was dominated by entirely different mythologies, moving further and further away from the reality of actual combat. To understand why the rest of the world was so unprepared for the reality of MMA, we must look at the trajectory of combat sports in the West during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While boxing was solidifying under the Queensberry rules, becoming a strict science of the fist, wrestling was undergoing a bizarre and ultimately fatal evolution. In the coal mining towns of northern England and the agricultural fairs of the American Midwest, a brutal, highly effective style of grappling developed known as catch-as-catch-can, or simply catch wrestling. Unlike the ancient Greco-Roman style, which forbade attacking the legs, catch wrestling allowed holds across the entire body. It was a vicious, grinding sport that heavily emphasized hooks, painful submission holds designed to stretch joints and compress muscles until the opponent yielded. Matches were fought on grass, dirt, or crude canvas mats, and they were genuine, grueling contests of physical supremacy. Catch wrestlers were incredibly formidable fighters. Legends like Martin Farmer Burns and Frank Gotch were national celebrities in America, drawing massive crowds to see legitimate, hours-long grappling matches. But catch wrestling suffered from a fatal economic flaw. A legitimate, unscripted wrestling match between two highly skilled grapplers is often very slow. It is a game of microscopic weight shifts, grueling stalemates, and isometric tension. To a casual spectator in a carnival tent, it could be incredibly boring to watch two men lay on a mat for an hour, sweating and not moving. Furthermore, carnival promoters realized that relying on a legitimate local champion was risky. What if the local hero lost to a challenger from the crowd? The promoter would lose his money and his draw. To guarantee entertainment, guarantee excitement, and guarantee the financial outcome, promoters began to script the matches. They instructed the wrestlers to cooperate, to perform high-flying throws, to artificially extend the drama, and to predetermine who would win and who would lose. This was the birth of professional wrestling. The legitimate, bone-breaking techniques of catch wrestling were transformed into theatrical performances known as worked matches. The truth of the combat was sacrificed for the spectacle of the show. By the mid-20th century, the American public had largely forgotten what a real grappling match looked like. They believed that the flamboyant, choreographed suplexes and staged brawls of television wrestling were reality. Meanwhile, in the realm of striking sports, a different kind of mythology was taking root. Following World War II and the Korean War, American servicemen returning from the Pacific brought back martial arts like karate and taekwondo. The 1970s saw the explosion of kung fu cinema, led by the incomparable Bruce Lee. These arts were beautiful, disciplined, and culturally fascinating, but because they were practiced almost entirely through non-contact forms, kaitas, point sparring, or heavily choreographed movie scenes, they lacked the crucial element of live, full resistance testing. The Western world developed a deep, unchallenged assumption. If a fight broke out, a karate master would deliver a lightning-fast, spinning kick to the jaw, ending the conflict instantly. The idea that a fight might end up on the ground in a messy, grueling grappling exchange was completely ignored. Striking was considered the ultimate, civilized form of self-defense. Wrestling was considered fake television entertainment. It would take a bizarre, deeply confusing international spectacle to expose the cracks in this mythology and set the stage for a global awakening. In 1976, the world witnessed one of the strangest, most widely publicized, and ultimately frustrating combat events in human history. Antonio Inoki was a towering, charismatic Japanese professional wrestler. He was trained in the legitimate, brutal arts of catch wrestling by the legendary Karl Gotch, but he made his millions performing in the theatrical, scripted world of New Japan Pro Wrestling. Inoki, however, desperately wanted to prove that professional wrestlers were the toughest, most legitimate fighters on the planet. He managed to secure a fight with the most famous athlete in the world, Muhammad Ali, the reigning, undisputed heavyweight boxing champion. The bout, held at the Nippon Budokan in Tokyo on June 26, 1976, was originally conceived by Ali's camp as a highly lucrative exhibition, a scripted show where Ali would eventually knock the wrestler out. But as the fight approached, Inoki made it terrifyingly clear that he had no intention of participating in a fake match. He intended to genuinely shoot on Ali, to take the boxer to the ground and break his limbs. Panic set in among Ali's management. They realized that their million-dollar asset was stepping into a ring with a giant grappler who could easily snap his arm. Days before the fight, Ali's camp forced severe, crippling restrictions on the rules. Inoki was forbidden from tackling, forbidden from throwing, and crucially, forbidden from kicking Ali, unless Inoki had one knee resting on the canvas. The resulting fight was a 15-round spectacle of absolute tactical absurdity. Because he was forbidden from standing and kicking, Inoki spent almost the entire fight literally lying flat on his back in the center of the ring, crab walking toward Ali and violently kicking the boxer's shins and thighs. Ali, the greatest heavyweight boxer in history, was completely paralyzed by this tactic. He had no idea how to punch a man who was lying on the ground. For 15 rounds, Ali danced around the perimeter of the ring, shouting insults, while Inoki relentlessly chopped away at his legs. By the end of the fight, Ali had thrown less than 10 total punches, and his left leg was so horribly bruised, swollen, and clotted with blood that he was hospitalized and nearly required an amputation. The match was declared a draw. The global public, expecting a cinematic clash of titans, was furious, booing the fighters out of the arena. They deemed it a farce, a boring, incomprehensible mess. But for a small, highly observant group of martial artists in Japan, the Inoki-Ali fight was a profound revelation. They looked past the bizarre rules and saw the undeniable truth hidden in the spectacle. Muhammad Ali, the most dangerous striker on earth, was completely neutralized by a man willing to exploit a different dimension of combat. The fight proved that a pure striker has no answer when the fight changes levels. Inspired by this realization, a faction of Japanese professional wrestlers, tired of the fake, scripted outcomes of their industry, decided to break away and pursue absolute reality. They wanted to strip away the theater and engage in legitimate, unscripted, mixed combat. In 1985, a brilliant wrestler named Satoru Sayama formed an organization called Shudo. It was a massive evolutionary leap. Shudo combined catch wrestling submissions with Muay Thai kickboxing. It was a real competitive sport with weight classes and strict rules. Following Shudo, in 1993, two professional wrestlers named Minoru Suzuki and Masakatsu Funaki formed an organization named Pankration, in homage to the ancient Greek sport. Pankration fights were real, brutal contests held in a wrestling ring. They allowed devastating submissions and kicks, though to protect the fighter's hands, closed fist punches to the face were banned, resulting in vicious, slapping open palm strikes that often caused massive cuts. Japan was slowly, methodically building the framework for a modern mixed martial art. They were applying a scientific method to combat. But across the Pacific Ocean in the United States, the general public remained entirely oblivious to these developments. America still believed that a boxing champion or a karate master with a black belt was the ultimate apex predator. It was time for the illusion to be shattered violently on live television. It was time for the Gracie family to bring Vale Tudo to the world stage. In the late 1980s, Rorion Gracie, the eldest son of Helio Gracie, moved from Brazil to Southern California. His mission was to spread the gospel of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu to America. He set up a mat in his garage in Torrance, California, and began issuing the famous Gracie Challenge to local martial arts instructors, kickboxers, and street fighters. Just as his father had done in Brazil decades earlier, Rorion effortlessly choked and submitted larger men who came to test him, filming the encounters and selling the tapes as Gracie in action documentaries. But Rorion wanted a bigger platform. He wanted to broadcast the absolute superiority of his family's art to the entire world simultaneously. He partnered with a marketing executive named Art Davey and a television producer named Campbell McLaren. Together, they pitched a radical, terrifying concept to the budding pay-per-view television industry. They proposed an 8-man, single-elimination tournament. They would gather the greatest champions from wildly different martial arts disciplines: a sumo wrestler, a kickboxer, a karate black belt, a professional boxer, a savate champion, a kenpo master, a shoot fighter, and a representative of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. They would place them in a cage and let them fight to the finish. The concept was marketed with gleeful, sensationalistic hyperbole. The tagline was, "There are no rules." This was a slight exaggeration. There were exactly 2 rules, mirroring the ancient Greek Pankration: no biting and no eye gouging. There were no weight classes. A 200-pound man could fight a 400-pound man. There were no time limits. There were no judges to award points. The fights would end only by knockout, submission, or the fighter's corner throwing a towel into the cage to signal surrender. Furthermore, there were no mandatory gloves. The fighters would compete bare-knuckled, exactly as they would in a street fight. To house this unprecedented violence, they needed an arena that did not favor any specific style. A boxing ring was too easy to fall out of for wrestlers. A circular wrestling mat had no boundaries to trap an opponent. The production designer, John Milius, a famous Hollywood director, helped design an 8-sided enclosure surrounded by heavy chain-link fencing. The Octagon was born. On November 12, 1993, at the McNichols Sports Arena in Denver, Colorado, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, UFC 1, went live on pay-per-view. The atmosphere in the arena was electric, chaotic, and deeply unsettling. No one, from the commentators to the fighters themselves, truly knew what was about to happen. The world was about to see martial arts, mythology, violently collide with empirical physics. The very first televised fight shattered decades of Hollywood illusions in exactly 26 seconds. Gerard Gordeau, a towering, ruthless Dutch savate kickboxer, faced Taylor Tooley, a massive 420-pound Hawaiian sumo wrestler. Tooley charged forward, lost his balance, and fell against the chain-link fence. As the giant sumo wrestler tried to rise, Gordeau delivered a devastating, bare-knuckled roundhouse kick directly to Tooley's face. The impact was sickening. 3 of Taylor Tooley's teeth were instantly launched out of his mouth. One flew into the crowd. Another embedded itself into Gordeau's foot. The third skittered across the canvas. The referee, John McCarthy, immediately leaped in to stop the fight. The crowd erupted in a mixture of awe and horror. This was not a choreographed movie. This was the terrifying, bloody reality of unrestricted combat. But the true revelation of UFC 1, the master stroke orchestrated by Rorion Gracie, was the fighter he chose to represent his family's art. Rorion did not choose his brother Rickson, who was a heavily muscled, undefeated physical specimen and the family champion. Instead, Rorion chose his younger brother, Royce. Royce Gracie weighed just 175 pounds. He wore a traditional white jai. He looked unassuming, slender, and entirely non-threatening compared to the heavily tattooed kickboxers and towering wrestlers in the tournament. This was entirely by design. Rorion wanted to prove his father Helio's ultimate thesis, that technique and leverage could overcome any size and strength disparity. If the massive Rickson won the to admit he won because of the art. What the world witnessed that night fundamentally altered the trajectory of martial arts forever. Royce Gracie faced minutes, completely bewildered. In the semifinals, Royce faced Ken Shamrock, a massive, heavily muscled American shoot fighter who had fought in Pankration in Japan and actually understood grappling. Shamrock managed to take Royce down, but from his back, Royce calmly wrapped his legs around Shamrock's neck, secured his arm, and applied a lapel choke using his own G-jacket, forcing the massive American to submit. In the finals, Royce faced the ruthless kickboxer Gerard Gordeau. Gordeau outweighed Royce by 40 pounds. Royce repeated the formula. He absorbed a few minor strikes, closed the distance, took the kickboxer down, tied him in a knot of limbs, and submitted him with a rear-naked choke. Royce Gracie won 3 fights in a single night, spending a total of less than 5 minutes in the octagon, without throwing a single significant punch. He barely broke a sweat. The world was stunned. The martial arts hierarchy was instantly turned upside down. The karate masters, the kung fu traditionalists, and the boxing purists were forced to confront a terrifying reality. If you do not know how to fight on the ground, you do not know how to fight at all. UFC 1 was a massive, unexpected commercial success. It spawned immediate sequels, but the very thing that made it popular, the raw, unregulated, bloody violence, was about to trigger a massive political backlash that would nearly destroy the sport in its infancy. As the UFC expanded through the mid-1990s, the spectacle grew darker. Fighters figured out that without rules, certain brutal tactics were highly effective. The sport devolved into bloody brawls. Fighters would grab their opponents by the hair and repeatedly punch them in the face. Groin strikes were shockingly common. Bouts became grueling, exhausting affairs where men lay on the canvas bleeding on each other for 30 minutes at a time. The visceral, uncontrolled violence caught the attention of the mainstream American media and, more dangerously, powerful politicians. Senator John McCain of Arizona, an avid boxing fan, saw a videotape of an early UFC event. He was utterly repulsed by what he saw. He famously condemned the sport on the floor of the United States Senate, labeling it human cockfighting. McCain launched a massive, highly effective political crusade to eradicate the sport from the face of the earth. He sent letters to the governors of all 50 states urging them to ban extreme fighting. The strategy worked. State athletic commissions refused to sanction the events. The UFC was forced to flee major arenas and hold their events in obscure, remote locations in states that lacked athletic regulation, such as Dothan, Alabama, or Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. More devastatingly, McCain successfully pressured the major cable television companies to drop the UFC from pay-per-view. This effectively severed the organization's primary artery of revenue. The UFC was cast into the shadows, existing only on VHS tapes traded in the back rooms of martial arts academies. This period, from roughly 1997 to 2001, is known by fans as the Dark Ages of MMA. But the political persecution forced a necessary, evolutionary maturation. The organizers realized that if the sport was ever going to survive, become legitimate, and return to television, it had to evolve past the no fundamentally transformed the landscape of the Octagon. They introduced mandatory weight classes to ensure fair competition. They instituted strict 5-minute rounds with 1-minute rest periods, creating a structure for cardiovascular exertion. They implemented a complex judging system based on a 10-point must scale, exactly like boxing, so that a fight could have a definitive winner, even if a knockout or submission did not occur. Most importantly, they banned the barbaric fouls that had horrified the public: headbutting, hair-pulling, groin strikes, kicking the head of a downed opponent. Strikes to the back of the neck and small joint manipulation were strictly outlawed. Finally, the rules mandated the equipment that would define the modern MMA aesthetic: the 4-ounce, open-fingered glove. The gloves were a masterstroke of compromise. They were padded just enough over the knuckles to reduce the superficial, horrific facial cuts that had plagued the early events, and to protect the striker's hands from shattering. But crucially, the fingers were left entirely exposed and free, allowing the fighters to execute the complex grips, throws, and submissions required for jiu-jitsu and wrestling. The sport had evolved. It was no longer Vale Tudo. It was mixed martial arts. But while America was wrestling with politics and regulation, the true golden age of the sport was exploding halfway across the world, bathed in neon lights, pyrotechnics, and the roar of 50,000 screaming fans. While the UFC was struggling to survive in the underground of America, Japan was experiencing a martial arts renaissance. In 1997, a new organization was formed in Tokyo called the Pride Fighting Championships. If the early UFC was a gritty, underground blood sport, Pride was a cinematic, multi-million-dollar gladiatorial opera. The Japanese culture views martial arts with deep, philosophical reverence. They do not view fighters as mere brawlers, but as modern-day samurai. Pride events were held in massive stadiums like the Tokyo Dome or the Saitama Super Arena, routinely drawing crowds of 40 to 70,000 people. The production value was staggering. Fighters were given elaborate, theatrical entrances, descending from the rafters on elevators, wearing terrifying masks, accompanied by laser light shows, symphonic orchestras, and the booming, dramatic voice of the iconic ring announcer Lenny Hart screaming their names. Pride operated under slightly different rules than the unified code in America. Bouts were fought in a massive, four-roped white ring, not a cage. The first round was a grueling 10 minutes long, designed specifically to test the cardiovascular limits of the fighters and allow complex grappling exchanges to develop without the interruption of a bell. And crucially, Pride allowed techniques that were banned in America. Fighters were permitted to deliver brutal knees to the head of a grounded opponent, and they could execute soccer kicks, winding up and kicking the head of a downed man as if striking a football. It was terrifyingly violent, but the Japanese fans watched the violence with silent, analytical respect, only erupting in polite applause when a complex technique was successfully executed. Pride was the crucible where the first generation of true, well-rounded mixed martial artists was forged. It was the home of Kazushi Sakuraba, known as the Gracie Hunter. Sakuraba was an eccentric, chain-smoking Japanese professional wrestler who wore bright orange shorts and entered the ring wearing superhero masks. But he possessed a brilliant, unorthodox grappling style. In the year 2000, he fought Royce Gracie in Pride in a grueling, epic contest featuring unlimited rounds that lasted for 90 minutes of continuous combat. Sakuraba systematically dismantled the legend, destroying Royce's legs with kicks until the Gracie corner threw in the towel. Sakuraba shattered the myth of Gracie invincibility. Pride was the realm of Mirko Cro Cop Filipovic, a terrifying Croatian anti-terrorist police officer with a left high kick so devastating that his famous motto was, "Right leg, hospital, left leg, cemetery." He proved that high-level, elite kickboxing could succeed in MMA if the fighter developed the defensive wrestling required to stay on their feet. And towering above them all was a quiet, doughy, seemingly emotionless Russian named Fedor Emelianenko. Fedor did not look like a bodybuilder. He looked like a stoic factory worker. But inside the ring, he was a force of devastating, explosive physics. He combined elite Olympic judo and Russian sambo with blindingly fast, heavy-handed boxing. He went undefeated for a decade, facing giants, elite strikers, and brilliant submission artists, systematically destroying them all with cold, algorithmic precision. Fedor proved that the ultimate fighter is entirely devoid of emotion, operating purely on instinct and mechanics. Pride was the undisputed king of global MMA in the early 2000s, but back in America, a desperate, final gamble was about to rescue the UFC from bankruptcy and ignite a mainstream explosion that would change the global sporting landscape forever. In 2001, the UFC was essentially a dead brand. It was bleeding money barred from cable television and sinking into obscurity. It was purchased for a mere $2 million by Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta, casino executives from Las Vegas, along with their childhood friend, a brash, aggressive boxing promoter named Dana White. They rebranded the company, embraced the unified rules, and worked tirelessly to get the sport sanctioned by the crucial Nevada State Athletic Commission. They succeeded in making the sport legal, but they were still losing millions of dollars. By 2004, they were over $40 million in debt. They needed a miracle to break into the mainstream American consciousness. They decided to risk the rest of their fortune on a Hail Mary. They fully funded a reality television show called The Ultimate Fighter. The premise was simple. Take 16 up-and-coming fighters, lock them in a house together, divide them into two teams coached by current UFC superstars, and have them fight each other in an empty gym, tournament style. The winner would receive a six-figure contract with the UFC. The show aired on Spike TV, a cable network aimed at young men following Monday Night Raw. It was a massive hit. The reality television format humanized the fighters. The public saw that these were not bloodthirsty thugs. They were dedicated, highly articulate, emotionally vulnerable athletes making massive sacrifices for their dreams. But the true explosion occurred on the night of the live finale on April 9th, 2005. The light heavyweight final featured Forrest Griffin, a rugged, self-deprecating former police officer from Georgia, against Stephan Bonnar, a skilled, incredibly tough fighter from Indiana. What followed was 15 minutes of the most chaotic, beautiful, exhausting, and transcendent violence ever broadcast on live cable television. Griffin and Bonnar stood in the center of the Octagon and engaged in an absolute war of attrition. They threw caution to the wind, abandoning technical defense to trade massive, heavy blows. Blood painted the canvas. The crowd in the arena went deafeningly quiet in awe, then erupted in sustained, primal roars. As the fight raged on, millions of viewers across America began calling their friends, telling them to change the channel. The ratings skyrocketed in real time. When the final horn sounded, both men, battered, exhausted, and bleeding, embraced in the center of the cage. Forrest Griffin was awarded the narrow decision, but Dana White, recognizing the historic magnitude of what they had just witnessed, offered Stephan Bonnar a contract on the spot as well. That single epic fight pulled the UFC out of the dark ages. It legitimized the sport in the eyes of the American public, proving that MMA possessed a level of dramatic, athletic heroism that boxing had lacked for decades. The UFC became a multi-billion-dollar empire, eventually absorbing Pride and dominating the global market. Today, the evolution of the martial artist is complete. In the early days of 1993, a fighter was a specialist. You were a boxer, a wrestler, or a jiu-jitsu practitioner, relying on the ignorance of your opponent to secure a victory. Today, ignorance does not exist in the Octagon. The modern mixed martial artist is the most highly evolved, scientifically trained combat athlete in human history. They begin cross-training in all disciplines from childhood. They must possess the footwork and head movement of a championship boxer, the explosive kicking power of a Thai Nak Muay, the relentless, grinding top pressure of an NCAA Division I wrestler, and the complex, fluid submission mechanics of a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. They must synthesize all of this into a seamless, transitional flow. A modern fighter will throw a punch not to knock the opponent out, but to force them to raise their hands, exposing their hips for a wrestling takedown, where they will instantly transition to a submission hold before the opponent's back even hits the canvas. It is a sport that demands absolute cardiovascular supremacy, possessing anaerobic thresholds that defy medical logic. It requires spatial awareness, tactical brilliance, and a psychological resilience that borders on the sociopathic. To step into the cage, a fighter must accept the very real possibility of profound physical trauma, suppress their biological flight response, and execute complex physics while under extreme duress. From the shifting, blood-soaked sands of the ancient Greek skama, where men fought to the death for a crown of olive branches, to the blinding neon lights of the modern Octagon, where athletes fight for gold belts and multi-million-dollar purses, the journey of mixed martial arts is the journey of human evolution itself. We took our most primal, violent instinct for survival, subjected it to thousands of years of philosophical refinement, mechanical engineering, and trial-by-fire testing, and produced the ultimate, undeniable truth of combat. We answered the primordial question. Thank you for choosing to engage deeply with this history today. By focusing on this single narrative, you are actively participating in the rewiring of your attention span. Subscribe to the channel, return in 3 days for your next deep dive, and continue taking your brain back.